Well, let's get the View now. Look at the opinion. Sorry.
30 seconds in the break.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, God.
5 seconds. There we go.
Well, time for the View. Look at the opinion pages of today's newspapers. Unsurprisingly, Boris Johnson's decision to prorogue Parliament dominates. In the Daily Telegraph, their cartoonist shows Boris Johnson running off with the keys to Parliament, locking opposition leaders and Remain backing Tories outside. While Peter Brook's cartoon in The Times shows a grinning Boris Johnson on that zip wire, waving no-deal flags. Stephen Glover urges Remainers to calm down. He says the Prime Minister's actions are far from a coup, adding he's more democratic than most. While Sherelle Jacobs in The Telegraph says recent events have in fact exposed Remain supporting MPs as being calculating and craven. The Conservative peer Danny Finkelstein, Lord Finkelstein, writes in his column in The Times that Boris Johnson's plan is not illegal or mad, but he says that doesn't make it right or wise. Polly Toynbee in The Guardian argues a civil war state of mind is threatening democracy. While James Kirkup goes a step further, writing that yesterday's events are in fact worse than a coup. They demonstrate the gradual erosion of our parliamentary system, he says, adding that Parliament is now a battleground where the winner takes all. John Rentoul in the newspaper says the timing of the Queen's speech is yet another sign that a general election is not too far away. And a very strong leader in the Financial Times says MPs must pass a no-confidence vote and trigger a general election. Finally, Paul Thomas's cartoon in the Mail shows the Queen on the phone to Boris Johnson, hiding behind her desk from Jeremy Corbyn, asking if the Labour leader could be prorogued as well. Well, joining me today to look through those are the Guardian columnists Zoe Williams and the writer Benedict Spence. Welcome to you both. Now, Zoe, is it civil war and unconstitutional behaviour, or do we all need to calm down a bit?
Are you really asking me that?
Yeah.
Look, it's fascinating. It is the only time I've not just in my lifetime, but going back to the 1640s, that the executive has been ranged against Parliament in this way. And what's so interesting is that people always talk about the Speaker and the Queen being neutral, and of course they are neutral, but they're only neutral until the executive and the Parliament are at odds, whereupon the Queen is de facto on the side of the executive.
The representative of the executive.
And the Speaker is de facto the representative of the parliamentarians. So just to get to a point where Bercow is saying this is a constitutional outrage and the Queen is waving it through shows you what an incredibly extreme thing this is to happen, even though I think its motives are basically kind of calculated electoral ones, and I don't think there is any kind of very interesting constitutional drive behind it. I think the impact is fascinating and earth-shattering.
I slightly disagree in that I don't believe it's a constitutional crisis, as a lot of people are making out. I do think that the precedent it sets and the pathway that we might then go down is where the crisis might come from. Ultimately, proroguing Parliament is nothing new. This has been debated plenty of times over again in the papers for the last few weeks and months, ever since it was raised. But the point is, let's say hypothetically that this idea is put to the country that Boris Johnson's government is behaving unconstitutionally. A lot of what this does, I think it accelerates the rate at which we are more likely to have a general election, at which point this will be put to the people. The question then is, are Brexiteers, Brexit voters more broadly, OK with this? And the worry that I think a lot of people must have is that the vote to leave the European Union wasn't just a vote against Europe per se, it was also a vote against Westminster. A lot of people are not very happy with the mechanisms of Westminster. And so even though they don't necessarily know very much about this necessarily, that doesn't necessarily matter, because it's a question then of saying, OK, is it unconstitutional? Is it not? people might go, well, yes, it is, but ultimately we want to change the system, so we don't mind so
look, I
much.
need to disagree on a couple of things. Of course, Parliament has been prorogued. Parliament has never been prorogued where there is a matter of national importance, of enormous consequence to every citizen
Well, except
in the country.
interestingly in 1945, when you could argue that there was a need for a timeout after the Second World War.
Well, look, but they took time out. They did not push anything through in that time out.
That's true.
I mean, this is really, it really does infuriate me to talk about this as though, we've used the word prorogue before and therefore this act has been committed before. It's not been committed before. It is as serious as Charles I trying to arrest John Pym. It is that serious. So there's that. On the matter of whether there's a general election and whether it's a people versus the Parliament election, this is what I meant about this really being a Boris manoeuvre rather than him having any serious...
But you see, that is James Kirkup's point.
Yeah,
I mean, he's saying, look, we've all got overexcited about this. There is a basic problem of the people's decision in the referendum and the mood of parliamentarians.
But I wouldn't follow it to James Kirkup. I don't think there is a problem with the people thinking one thing and parliamentarians thinking another. We've had a long time to examine the prospect of Brexit, and most people who've looked at it have said, well, it's extremely difficult, and is it worth it? So it's not like there's this huge mass of the people who were always possessed by a desire to leave Europe and then got to speak about it. This is a Tory civil war that has been imposed on the rest of the country and has caused great devastation.
But the rest of the party have taken sides, that's the point.
So one half does the other. I do believe that this is a civil war being played out in the Conservative Party, but I disagree completely that there isn't this great mass of people who feel very much as though they're not being listened to. And in many ways, I disagree. I think Europe is actually the vehicle by which they are venting a lot of their frustrations. But you can't deny the fact that that is the option that was given to them. Again, the fault of the Conservative Party, shouldn't have perhaps gone down the route that they did. But this is the situation we find ourselves in. It's all very well saying, oh, well, that's not the case. Well, it clearly is the case. And we're going to get a lot closer to having a general election when we will find out for certain.
Now, what about the point that Daniel Finkelstein makes where he says, look, it's not illegal, it's not mad, but on the other hand, Boris Johnson will come to regret behaving in this time.
Well, look, I mean, basically, he's really done a technical thing. He didn't want... It looked very much like the Remain alliance was coalescing around a legislative route rather than a vote of no confidence route. So they were coalescing around, let's bring a bill forward, which Bercow would have scheduled to block no deal, and then Boris would have been boxed in. He's prorogued in order to force them to use those days between the 3rd and the 10th to call an election rather than block no deal, because if they'd blocked no deal, he would have then had to call the election, and then he would have gone back on the promise not to call an election. Now, Boris is no stranger to going back on promises, and he's no stranger to lying, so I don't know why he took that so seriously, but he obviously did. Now, when you look at it like that, it's not very seismic in his head, but from Danny Finkelstein's point is correct. Just because it doesn't seem consequential to Boris to do this to get what he wants, it is consequential to democracy and it is consequential to the atmosphere of Parliament.
I think the gamble that the government is making, I think Lord Finkelstein is referring to something similar that Ross Clark talks about in The Telegraph, which is that we could be here in 5 years' time and have a far-left government, proroguing Parliament so that, policies are just being forced through. And I do understand that point. I think that what people in the government, certainly people like Dominic Cummings, might turn around and say in response to that is, well, if we don't deliver Brexit, we won't be in power anyway. So that's a gamble that you're willing to take in order to see this thing through, because if you don't, well, then the Conservative Party is finished. OK, thank you both very much indeed. Lots more to come in the next hour. This is All Out Politics. Coming up next.